I can still smell the bittersweet scent of dry morlo seeping into the wool of my coat when I close my eyes. The warm liquid ran down my shoulder to my belly like a war map, and the entire room fell silent for an impossible second before laughter sliced through the air like sheathed knives. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I just turned slowly, my heart beating in time with the bass that trembled against the walls, and registered each face, the wide eyes, the suppressed smiles, the hands raising glasses to their lips to hide their embarrassment. My daughter held her glass aloft, a red arc dripping from the crystal, and the world, for a moment, fit into the narrow slot between her guilt and my decision. I'm a mother of 2 daughters, raised in a quiet neighborhood of white picket fences and manicured lawns, the kind of place where people sweep the sidewalk on Saturdays and chat about the weather at the grocery store, as if the heavens had a contract with the neighbors. I believed that traditional families prevailed through disciplined silence, that sorrows folded like sheets and went into the bottom drawer. I learned this from my mother, who smiled at guests while hiding the patches on dish towels. Years later, I discovered that silence also has a smell, a mixture of burnt coffee, cheap perfume, and unspoken promises. The party was hers, my firstborn, 24, a girl who grew up amid soccer uniforms, piano lessons, and Sunday sermons, as American as the little flags neighbors plant in their gardens on Memorial Day. I'd arrived early to help with the candles and napkins, and I spent half an hour lining up silver cutlery that reflected the yellow light from the kitchen, as if I could polish our ancient edges with a flannel. The sound of ice in buckets, the frying of mini quiches, the hum of the refrigerator, all of it formed a soundtrack of carefully staged normalcy. The music began to fill the living room just before sunset, when a cold wind scratched at the windows, and the smell of wet leaves drifted in through the half-open door. Her friends arrived in waves, loud laughter, boots thumping on the hardwood floor, jackets hanging on the stairs. I made myself useful, that's my role, refilling trays, washing glasses, arranging pillows. Every suburban mother knows the choreography of being needed without being seen. Still, I noticed that every time I passed, my daughter avoided my eyes, as if my steps dragged invisible chains through the house. It was during the toast that everything began to shift, like a shelf bending before giving way. Her boyfriend, I've never been able to call him a son-in-law, raised his glass and spoke beautiful words, full of promises too strong to fit into short sentences. The crowd raised their crystal glasses, and I, water glass in hand, smiled with a wariness that seemed sewn into my face. My daughter then turned to me with a gleam in her eyes I hadn't seen since she was 12, when she won her first trophy, and I thought, maybe today we'll meet halfway. But the glow was different. There was something metallic there, a laugh that didn't come from the chest, and the next gesture was too quick to be accidental and too slow to be forgiven. The glass tilted, the Merlot flying in a perfect arc, red on gray, wine on mother. I felt the fabric soak, an instant heat followed by the chill of exposure. I smelled grapes and humiliation rising together, and for a long second, I heard my own breath taking the place of the music. Someone blurted out, and it was an accident, the kind we fabricate as a social reflex, but her hand trembled afterward, not before, and the look she gave me was a bottomless mirror. It wasn't an accident, it was a message. And if you think a mother can't read the secret alphabet of her children's gazes, it's because she hasn't yet confronted the silent nature of a resentment that has grown within the home, fueled by small choices, by involuntary comparisons, by expectations announced in the sweetest voices. My throat burned with a mixture of wine and embarrassment, and the heat that crept up my neck had nothing to do with alcohol. The coat, which I saved for special occasions, weighed heavily on my shoulders, as if it held sewn into it every criticism I'd ever made, every unsaid word, every "I'm just trying to help" that translated sucked the air from the room. I heard the nervous giggles spreading like a discreet virus, and the music returned, but it wasn't the same song. It was now beating out of step with my heart. I could have gone to the bathroom, closed the door, and cried quietly as my mother would have done. I could have smiled broadly, said it was nothing, and asked for a napkin, fulfilling the ritual of modesty that saves face and condemns truths. Instead, I remained still, as if in front of an invisible camera, and memorized the scene: the table with the white flowers, the layered cake with gold edges, the ribbon fallen to the floor, the candles still unlit, the wood glowing in the kitchen, light, the scent of rosemary wafting from a dish on the counter. It was then that an old memory pierced me with the clarity of a shrapnel. My daughter at 16, running upstairs after an argument about schedules, screaming that I controlled everything, that even the way she breathed felt like a test to me. I, at the foot of the stairs, responded with a mother's worst weapon: the silence that turns into judgment, the gaze that weighs heavily. She slammed the door, I banged pots and pans, and the house shook secretly. Life went on, yes, but between us a thin groove remained, a nearly invisible crack that time only deepened. "Sorry, Mom," she said, but the word fell to the floor like a used napkin. Her boyfriend touched her arm, and she pulled away with the delicacy of someone who didn't want to seem cruel. I didn't respond. I walked to the kitchen, my steps firm, my shoes echoing on the floor, each step a countdown to which I couldn't even fathom. The cold kitchen lamp greeted me with an electric hum, and the sink gleamed with stainless steel, a domestic altar where so many confessions had been washed. I turned on the faucet, let the water run, and watched the clear thread try to compete with the red in the fabric. The wine stained the sink with patterns reminiscent of veins, rivers, and roots. I washed my hands like someone preparing a ritual, and heard her laugh in the background, a laugh I knew but hadn't included me in years. I saw myself reflected in the microwave's glass. Sunken eyes, hastily tied hair, the silver necklace my mother had given me. And I realized there was a decision hanging in the air, waiting for my gesture to fall. I grabbed a towel, took a deep breath, dried my face firmly, and left the towel folded exactly along the countertop, as I do when I need to prove to myself that I still have some semblance of order. Then I opened the cabinet where she keeps the best wines, the ones she says are for celebrations. My hands knew that kitchen because despite everything, it was in mine that she learned the weight of a pan, the patience of low heat, the beauty of a well-prepared dish. I touched the bottles like someone reading the titles of forbidden books. The music slowed to a slower tempo, and conversations settled into low notes like a cautious choir. I heard footsteps approaching and without turning around, recognized my daughter's perfume, jasmine notes with a warm base, the same one I'd bought her for her 21st birthday in that store where saleswomen wrap guilt in elegant bows. "Mom, let me clean that up," she said, but it sounded like someone offering a tissue after a shove. I simply replied, "No need." There are things that aren't about the wine, the coat, the party. There are things that are about the roles we assumed, without a contract, about who decided I would be the wall for her arrows, and about when I silently consented to love becoming a kind of furniture, too heavy to move. As I thought, my hand already gripped a corkscrew. The cold metal in the grip felt like a verdict. I listened to my own heart as if it had an open microphone, and each beat took a step forward, until I knew I was no longer washing away a stain. I was responding to an old letter written between the lines for years. The corkscrew bit into the cork with a dry snap. The bottle sighed. A deep scent of fruit and wood rose like an old secret opening its door. And in that breath, I decided I wouldn't just survive this humiliation. I would return it, with the calm of someone serving dinner. I returned to the living room carrying a bottle she'd been saving for something special. Every face looked first at the wine, then at me, and I could see the question taking root in the guest's curiosity. Her boyfriend pressed his lips together. Her eyes narrowed, and my youngest stared at the floor. I stood behind the cake like a mistress of ceremonies and heard only the distant crack of laughter in the backyard, the clink of ice cubes as someone swirled a glass, the click of the thermostat turning on the heater. "Daughter," I said, and the murmur in the room stopped like water freezing in the air. "Let's make a toast, as you deserve." My voice was clear, without tremor, a straight line drawn over a cracked surface. She nodded, not yet understanding that sometimes a toast is a mirror. I lifted the bottle with the same hand that years ago had held hers as we crossed the street, and the weight was different, but the intention was not. I poured a generous stream into her glass, the liquid dancing in the light, and offered it to her with a toothless smile. She took it. The room breathed. I then filled another glass, my own, with the same amount, and for a millimeter-long second, we stared at each other, two similar women, each reading an unspoken paragraph into the other. I raised the glass to eye level, and the crystal sang, a thin sound that cut through any residual conversation. "To the women of our house," I said, "who learned too early to swallow what burns." Some smiled, uncomprehending. Others shifted, uncomfortably. My daughter held the glass aloft. I, still holding the bottle, moved close enough to smell the jasmine scent again. The world became as small as the space between our mouths and the secret that had always remained there. And it was in that tiny interval, when time grows short and choices become vast, that I tilted the bottle, not on the table, not on the floor, but on the pale dress she'd chosen to appear ethereal. The wine fell in a precise line, a line that crossed from shoulder to hip, and the fabric drank the stain with the thirst of new fabrics. It wasn't abrupt, it wasn't theatrical, it was surgical, meticulous, like someone returning a letter, stamping it and forwarding it to the sender. The sound that rang out wasn't a scream, it was a collective gasp, as if the entire house had remembered to breathe at once. My daughter stood still, her eyes wide, the glass dancing imperceptibly in her fingers. Her mouth opened in a way I recognized from the time she was a child, seeing the ocean for the first time, somewhere between fascination and fear. I held the bottle low, my arm relaxed, and waited for the first word she would choose, the verdict of our story. And before any words could be spoken, I heard my mother's voice. As old as the house I grew up in, saying that revenge is a dish we should never serve, even when it's just right. I took a deep breath, smelled the wine, the cake, the rosemary, the jasmine, my own sweat, and knew that what I had done was just the beginning of something that could no longer be swept under the rug. The party wasn't over. It simply changed genre from joyful to inevitable. It was at that moment that my phone vibrated in the pocket of my wet coat, a wasp-like tremor against the woolen seam. I pulled out the device with steady fingers, never taking my eyes off my daughter, and saw a notification that didn't need to arrive at that moment, a nameless message on the screen, an unknown number that said, "If you knew the real reason for the toast, you wouldn't have worn gray." The wine suddenly seemed to disappear into the color of my coat, and the chill that pierced me didn't come from outside. It was the promise of secrets yet to be revealed. My phone was still vibrating, in my hand, when I realized the entire room had transformed into a kind of frozen stage. No one spoke. No one moved. Only the text on the screen burned my eyes. If you knew the real reason for the toast, you wouldn't have worn gray. It was as if someone, hidden among the guests, had decided to pull an invisible thread in our lives, and force me to confront an embroidery I'd always avoided deciphering. The wine on her dress no longer seemed like the biggest stain of the evening. Now the problem lay in the silence, laden with questions. My daughter, still motionless, stared at me unblinkingly. There was a heaviness in the air that was more suffocating than the smell of spilled wine. I wondered if she had also received that message, if that look wasn't one of surprise at the stain, but at what was yet to come. The glass in her hand trembled slightly, the crystal making a barely perceptible clink. It was in that detail that I realized something bigger was happening, and I was the only one who didn't yet have the complete map. I put my phone back in my pocket, but the chill of those words clung to my skin. I remained standing before her, and a gnawing thought began to take shape. What if that toasting performance was just the tip of a secret my own daughter was trying to hide? Maybe the wine spilled on me wasn't just revenge or a message. Maybe it was a gesture of anger barely disguised as fear. The guests began to whisper. The sound of their low voices seemed like a swarm forming on the ceiling, buzzing, mixed with the insistent clicking of the living room clock. Her boyfriend ran his hand through his hair and looked away, as if trying to escape a question he couldn't answer. I sat on the edge of a chair, trying not to look defeated, but the hard wood on my back reminded me there was no way to relax tonight. That's when my daughter took her first step toward me. Her stiletto heel hit the hardwood floor and echoed like a gunshot. "Mom, why did you do that?" she asked, but her voice was low, almost choked. I could have said 1,000 things, that it was only justice, that she had started it, that I would no longer accept being a target. But what came out of my mouth was a heavy silence, a silence she herself had known since adolescence, when I preferred to punish with indifference. Deep down, I knew that "why did you do that?" wasn't just about the wine on the dress. It was a question that cut through years of pent-up tension, criticism disguised as advice, looks that never fully accepted. It was a question about our entire history, and for the first time, I felt the true weight of the answer I never gave. As I struggled to resist, I heard my mother repeat in my memory that certain truths should not be spoken in public. Wash dirty laundry at home, not in front of everyone, but there, in front of everyone, there was no longer any clean or private laundry. Her stained dress was a billboard of our failures, and I was as exposed as she was. It was at that moment that I saw the youngest, standing near the door, holding her phone as if she'd also received a message. Her startled gaze met mine for a second, and a chill ran down my spine. She lowered her eyes too quickly, and I knew it wasn't a coincidence. Someone else was moving the gears that night, and it wasn't us. The boyfriend, perhaps trying to lighten the mood, raised his voice. "Okay, guys, let's continue the party. It was just an accident, nothing major." But no one believed him. Eyes darted around the room like spears. Even the cake, with its perfectly aligned layers, looked like an awkward spectator waiting for the next act. My daughter took a deep breath, as if trying to regain control, and headed to the bathroom to try to clean the stain. The sound of the doctor slamming echoed through the hallway, and in that tense silence, I took the opportunity to pull out my phone again. I opened the message and simply replied, "Who are you?" I didn't wait long. The reply came almost instantly. "I'm someone who knows what she's been hiding from you for months." I felt my hand tremble. What could be so serious as to justify such a cryptic message of all nights? My head whirled with possibilities: debts, betrayal, an undisclosed pregnancy, or something even more obscure. I knew my daughter, but at the same time I realized how much I didn't know about her. Adulthood had turned her into someone full of closed doors, and I only had the key to a distant childhood. I got up and went to the kitchen, pretending to look for napkins. The noise of the guests mingled with my racing heart. I needed to understand. but I couldn't seem desperate. I grabbed a table knife and cut a small slice of cake, just to disguise it, and felt the sweet taste turn to bitterness in my mouth. Sugar couldn't erase the taste of distrust. When I returned to the living room, my daughter was already back, her dress still damp, but with a coat over it, trying to compose herself. She approached her boyfriend, whispered something quickly in his ear, and the two exchanged a look I couldn't decipher. There was complicity, yes, but also fear. And that fear, I realized, wasn't directed at me. I sat back down, but now my eyes roamed every face. Who among those guests would have reason to send me such a message? Who knew details of our lives that could be used as a weapon? The fake laughs, the exchanged glances, everything seemed choreographed by an invisible director. Time suddenly slowed. The music seemed distant, the voices muffled. All I could think about was what was about to surface. The spilled wine was just a prologue, and I was already in the middle of a story much bigger than a mother-daughter fight. It was in this state of alert that I received the second message. If you really want to understand, wait until midnight. The truth can't be wiped away with a towel. The screen flashed before my eyes, and I felt like the party was just beginning, but not the way my daughter had planned. And there, surrounded by people pretending not to hear, I understood. That night wasn't about stains, it was about revelations. What was to come would force me to face not only my daughter, but the entire family in the mirror. The living room clock read a little after 10, but each hand seemed to drag invisible chains. I kept my eyes on my phone, waiting for a new vibration, while pretending to listen to the conversations around me. The house still throbbed with music and forced laughter, but beneath the surface lay something denser, almost palpable, a suspense that only I seemed to sense. It was as if every second were a rehearsal for the revelation promised at midnight. My daughter walked around the room with her smile restored, but her shoulders betrayed the tension. I watched her hug friends, pose for photos, raise a new glass, this time with water, not wine. But with every movement she glanced at me, as if checking to see if danger was still in the room. And I was there, more present than ever, ready to decipher what she was hiding. The boyfriend tried to entertain the guests, but he couldn't hide his nervousness. His eyes darted to the cell phone in his pocket, as if he too was waiting for something. It was like watching a play where all the actors knew the script except me, and that hurt more than the wine on my coat. I was the intruder in a story that should have been mine, since it concerned my own daughter. With each step I took between the furniture, I felt the room shrink. The carpet, the curtains, the paintings on the wall, they all seemed like silent witnesses, guarding secrets I'd never been invited to hear. Even the scent of scented candles, mixed with dry wine, seemed to mock the idea of family harmony we'd tried to uphold. It was a beautiful house, yes, but now it felt like the scene of a trial. Inside, I began to replay memories. The way my daughter had been avoiding me for the past few months, the unanswered calls, the long silences during Sunday dinners. I'd always assumed it was just adulthood, the quest for independence. But what if it was more? What if, all along, she'd been hiding something that involved more people than I could ever imagine? My youngest daughter approached slowly with light steps and whispered close to my ear, "Mom, did you get a message too?" My heart nearly leapt out of my chest. I stared at her, trying to decipher whether it was innocence or complicity. She bit her lip and looked away, as if afraid to say more. That confirmed what I already suspected. It wasn't just me. Someone was playing a game with our whole family. Gradually, the noise of the party faded into background noise. All I could hear was the pounding in my ears and the irritating ticking of the clock. My hands were sweating, but I kept my face straight. As I'd learned from a young age, Never let the world see your cracks. I knew I had to hold out until midnight, but how could I wait in silence when my own daughter might be the protagonist of a secret that included me? The cake was finally cut, and the singing of Happy Birthday sounded almost funereal to me. I sang yes, but each word came out heavy, like lead. My daughter blew out the candles and made a wish she didn't reveal. I wondered if her wish wasn't actually just for me to disappear. The collective laughter after the blowing seemed overly rehearsed, as if everyone agreed to keep up the charade. After the cake, most people returned to drinking. Glasses filled, conversations resumed, but I noticed that eyes returned to me in short intervals. I was the invisible stain on the party, the reminder that something had gotten out of control. Some even laughed too loudly, as if trying to stifle their conscience. But the mood didn't recover. Tension hung like invisible smoke. In the midst of this atmosphere, my phone vibrated again. My hands trembled when I saw the message. She didn't tell you because she's afraid of what will come to light. At midnight, no one will be able to pretend anymore. I swallowed hard. There was no way to ignore it. This wasn't just any threat. It was an invitation to witness an inevitable revelation. My first impulse was to go to my daughter and demand answers, but something held me back. Maybe it was a mother's instinct. Maybe it was fear of what I would hear. Instead, I took a deep breath and sat on the edge of the sofa. I began to observe every detail. The slow, ticking clock, the reflection of lights on glasses, the broken conversations. Everything seemed charged with a symbolism I didn't yet understand. My daughter suddenly received a call. She answered quickly and walked away to the backyard, covering the phone with her hand as if protecting a secret. I followed her with my eyes through the window. She was gesturing, speaking softly, and seemed to be arguing with someone. Her boyfriend tried to distract her, but she jerked his hand away. That wasn't the behavior of someone relaxed at their own party. She returned a few minutes later, forcing a smile once more. But this time, I noticed, her eyes were moist. I don't know if it was anger, fear, or sadness, but something was about to explode. With each step she took, I felt midnight approaching like a verdict. I spoke to my youngest daughter again, discreetly. She confirmed that she had also received mysterious messages, but she didn't want to reveal them. She simply said, "Mom, it's not about you. It's about her. But you're going to end up in the middle." Those words fell on me like stones. I didn't want to be just a bystander, but I wasn't ready to be a target either. I returned to the table, filled my glass with water, and left my cell phone beside me. There was no escape. I just had to hold out until the appointed time. The fear wasn't just about the revelation itself, but about what would come after it. What could change our family forever when that secret came to light? Little by little, I realized I wasn't the only one anxious. Some guests kept glancing at the door, others at their phones. It was as if there was a silent pact in the room, a collective anticipation. Perhaps more people knew than I did. And this feeling made me feel even more isolated. As the minutes dragged on, one detail caught my attention. The music suddenly stopped. The sound system, which had been running all night, went silent without explanation. The guests looked at each other, in confusion, but no one got up to fix it. Absolute silence fell over the house like a warning. I glanced at the clock. It was only 40 minutes to midnight, and it was in that moment that I understood. The real toast was yet to come, and it wouldn't involve glasses, but truths that could split our family forever. The sudden silence of the house. Music transformed the room into a capsule where every breath seemed amplified. The sound of spoons hitting plates, ice clinking in glasses, even the sound of a guest adjusting a chair. Everything took on an uncomfortable clarity. I looked around and saw tense expressions, as if everyone were waiting for an official announcement. The absence of melody wasn't just technical, it was symbolic, as if someone had muted the soundtrack so the truth could be heard without distraction. My daughter noticed it too. She stopped in the middle of the room, her smile still plastered on her face, but her eyes betrayed an unease she couldn't hide. Her boyfriend tried to reach out and hug her, but she moved away subtly, as if she didn't want any touch that might give her away. This public withdrawal didn't go unnoticed. A few guests exchanged quick glances, confirming there was something deeper at play than just a stained dress. I sat still, as if I were part of the furniture, but inside my heart was pounding wildly. The memory of the message I'd received burned in my mind, and the youngest warning echoed endlessly. It's not about you, it's about her, but you'll end up in the middle. That in the middle weighed heavily, as if I were the bridge between two banks about to collapse. I decided to get up and walk to the kitchen, just to get away from the collective pressure of the living room. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the hallway, and when I arrived, I saw that dirty glasses were piled in the sink. The smell of wine and cake mixed with frying grease made me nauseous. I braced my hands on the counter and took a deep breath. There was no point in pretending. That night had spiraled out of my control, and all I could choose was whether to watch in silence or face it head on. It was then that I heard the back door creak open. I peeked through the crack and saw my daughter back in the backyard, talking on her cell phone, this time with her face covered by her hand. Her voice was raised, almost pleading. I couldn't hear her exact words, but I recognized the rhythm of her anguish. She paced back and forth, kicking dry leaves, as if struggling against something bigger than she could handle. Minutes later, she returned to the room and I could tell she'd been crying. Her eyes were red, but she tried to mask it with forced laughter. She grabbed a new glass, poured herself some champagne, and toasted with two friends, as if everything was normal. I knew it wasn't. The scene seemed rehearsed, as if she needed to prove something to the others, and it was precisely this effort to appear light-hearted that betrayed otherwise. My phone vibrated again. This time the message was short. You need to be alert at 11:45 p.m. I glanced at the clock and saw it was just over half an hour away. What would happen at that time? Fear and curiosity mixed inside me like two insoluble liquids. I wanted to run away, but something stronger kept me there. The need to know, to tear off the masks my daughter and perhaps others were wearing. Little by little, I noticed that the guests were also restless. A group of young men was speaking, quietly, constantly glancing at the door. One of my daughter's friends was whispering in another's ear and discreetly pointing at me. Her boyfriend, restless, was typing quick messages on his phone. It was clear I wasn't the only one on edge. The entire room seemed to be participating in a plot that only I wasn't fully aware of. My youngest, always more observant, approached me again. In a barely audible voice, she said, "Mom, get ready. What's going to happen isn't just about us, it's bigger." She then backed away, as if she'd said more than she should have. That made my stomach churn. If even she already knew the gravity of it, what exactly was being prepared for midnight? The clock ticked on, and each minute felt like a test of patience. The cake was almost completely served, the glasses were already half full, but no one was leaving. It was as if everyone knew the party wasn't over, that something was yet to come. People lingered, not for the celebration, but for the anticipation of an inevitable spectacle. I sat back down by the window and noticed that the night was eerily silent outside. No cars passing, no dogs barking, just the wind rustling the leaves of the tree in the backyard. This contrast with the tension inside the house made me think of how, to the outside world, we were just another family together. But inside, we were about to fall apart. My daughter went upstairs to her room at some point, perhaps to compose herself. She stayed up there for about 10 minutes. When she came down, she had a different necklace around her neck, as if she'd shed her skin. Her gaze was firmer, almost defiant. She returned to the center of the room and said loudly, "Thank you all for being here. Today is a special day for me." There was applause, but it was cold, automatic, and without any real enthusiasm. Just then I received another message. "What she's about to say isn't the whole truth. Wait." I felt the ground slip away for a second. Whoever it was knew exactly what was happening, as if they were controlling every act of the play. I looked around, trying to identify suspicious faces, but everyone seemed silently complicit. My daughter's speech was short. She talked about her achievements, thanked her boyfriend, praised her friends, and mentioned her family in general terms. But there was a rigidity in every word, as if the text had been memorized. I noticed she avoided looking at me. This detail cut deeper than any rehearsed sentence. After the speech, the boyfriend tried to speak, but his voice faltered. He said only a few vague phrases about togetherness and the future. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. No one seemed convinced. The atmosphere was no longer that of a party, but rather that of a courtroom, where every gesture would be used as evidence. I glanced at the clock again. It was 11:30 p.m. My entire body went into overdrive. I knew the appointed time was almost here. I felt like I was about to witness something that would forever change not only the party, but also the way I viewed my own family. As the clock ticked forward a few minutes, I noticed my daughter walking towards the front door. She stopped, looked back, and for a second, our eyes met. There was something in her eyes I'd never seen before. It wasn't just fear, it was resignation, as if she knew that in a few minutes, nothing would be hidden anymore. I sat firmly in my chair, but inside, I braced myself. At 11:45 p.m., something was going to happen, and I couldn't avoid it anymore. The only choice left was to face whatever came, even if it meant shattering everything I believed about us. The clock ticked like a patient executioner, each second a blow I couldn't avoid. It was 11:40 p.m. when I felt my entire body stiffen. The guests continued to mill about the room, but the atmosphere was no longer one of celebration. It was one of anticipation. I'd never seen so many people gathered at a party where no one was actually enjoying themselves. It was as if everyone knew a dark spectacle was about to begin, and each of them, in some way, was part of the audience. My daughter, still standing near the door, kept her arms crossed, her coat covering her stained dress. Her face was firm, but her eyes betrayed her. I could sense a deep exhaustion, as if she no longer had the strength to maintain this act. It was like watching someone holding a crystal glass about to fall. No matter how hard she tried, the impact was inevitable. Her boyfriend, restless, approached her at short intervals, muttering rapid words and gesturing as if trying to convince her of something. She simply shook her head. This repeated refusal increased the tension between them, and some guests were already watching them openly, barely concealing their curiosity. My phone vibrated again, and this time the message seemed more urgent. "Stay where you are. At 11:45 p.m., you'll understand." I swallowed hard. My hands trembled in my lap, and the youngest, beside me, stared at me intently, as if trying to read my mind. I discreetly grabbed her arm and asked quietly if she knew what was about to happen. She simply replied, "Not everything, but it's about her and about him." Those 3 words, about her and him, echoed in me like a gunshot. I looked at the couple, my daughter and her boyfriend, and a wave of memories flooded my mind. The awkward smiles at recent family dinners, the times she'd come home too late and avoid comment, the way he, always too polite, seemed to hide something in his eyes. Suddenly all those ignored signs made sense, even if I couldn't quite put my finger on what. At 11:43 p.m., the tension became almost unbearable. The hubbub died down, and the few who still pretended to talk now only murmured short phrases. The cake was forgotten, the glasses nearly empty, but no one was leaving. Everyone was trapped, in that house, by something bigger than a party. It was as if we had been summoned to a collective revelation. My daughter took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked to the center of the room. Her heels clicked on the hardwood floor, each step like a requiem. Eyes turned to her, and the silence that followed was absolute. Not even the ice cubes dared move in their glasses. My mouth felt dry. When the clock struck 11:45 p.m., my phone vibrated again. The message read, "Now." In the same split second, my daughter opened her mouth to speak, but it wasn't her voice that filled the room. It was someone else's. One of the guests, a young man I barely knew, a college friend of hers perhaps, stood up and said loudly, "It's time everyone knows." The sentence fell like a thunderclap across the room. Eyes met, the air seemed to grow, heavier, and I gripped the arms of my chair to keep my balance. My daughter went pale, her boyfriend's eyes widened, and my youngest squeezed my hand tightly. The boy took his phone out of his pocket, unlocked the screen, and said, "You guys pretend everything's fine, but it's not. That's what tonight is for." The entire room was mesmerized, and I, in the midst of it all, felt my heart race to the point where it almost jumped out of my chest. My daughter tried to intervene, walking over to him and whispering something in his ear, but he shook his head. "I can't hide it anymore," he replied, loud enough for everyone to hear. Her boyfriend clenched his fists, visibly nervous, and took a step forward as if he wanted to snatch the phone from his hand. It was then that the youngest, still holding my hand, whispered, "Mom, it's about betrayal. I've heard it before, but I don't know if it's against you or against him." Those words hit me like a knife. Betrayal. The words sounded bitter, more bitter than any spilled wine. The next few seconds were the longest of the night. My daughter, in the center of the room, seemed to be falling apart. The guy with the cell phone lifted it and showed something to everyone, but the crush of bodies prevented me from seeing it right away. I only heard the murmurs growing, a shockwave, spreading through the room like wildfire. The boyfriend, in despair, tried to leave through the door, but my daughter grabbed his arm, shouting, "No! You'll face it!" Her voice echoed throughout the room, and that was the moment I realized. The secret wasn't just hers. He was in on it too. I instinctively stood up, my legs wobbly, but my gaze fixed on the scene. I didn't know exactly what was being exposed, but I was certain that whatever came next would forever change the way I looked at my own daughter and the man beside her. And there, when the clock still read 11:45 p.m., I realized that the spilled wine had been just a rehearsal. The real spill was about to happen, and it would be of truths that couldn't be cleaned up even with 1,000 towels. The cell phone held aloft by the young man reflected the yellow light of the room, and for a moment, no one breathed. I didn't. You know what he was going to show, but I could see in the guests' eyes that the impact would be devastating. A dense silence fell, and the sound of the clock on the wall seemed to be the only one daring to make its presence felt. My daughter reached out to try to snatch the phone away, but he dodged it, keeping his arm firmly in the air, as if holding irrefutable evidence. From where I was, I could see the screen for a second. It was a string of messages, screenshots, text exchanges between two people who, to anyone's eyes, shouldn't be speaking to each other like that. The contact's name wasn't visible, but the initials gave it away. They were hers. They were her boyfriend's, and they were someone else's. A buzz began to ripple through the room, whispers exploding like crackling logs. My daughter turned red, then pale, and her boyfriend lunged at the boy, trying to snatch the phone from his hand. "Delete that now!" he shouted, but his voice sounded more like a desperate plea than an order. The boy took 2 steps back, keeping the screen visible, and replied, "Everyone here has a right to know." My stomach churned. The messages, even at a glance, contained phrases too intimate to be mistaken. This wasn't just a friendship. They were hidden declarations, arranged meetings, promises made in the dark. My daughter tried to deny it, shaking her head, but the words printed on the screen burned like fire on paper. The guests were divided between disbelief and curiosity. Some covered their mouths in shock. Others looked at me as if I had some explanation to offer. The ground seemed to disappear from under my feet. I, who had always been the attentive mother, who believed I knew her every step, now found myself facing a daughter hiding secrets capable of shattering not only her life, but the image of our entire family. Her boyfriend, distraught, pushed the boy, and some guests stepped in to prevent the argument from escalating into a fight. My daughter cried, but still tried to maintain her composure, repeating short phrases. "This isn't what it seems. It's a lie. He's distorting everything." But no one seemed convinced. The messages spoke for themselves. At that moment, my youngest daughter turned to me and said through unshed tears, "Mom, it's worse than you think." Her words were like a final blow. My body went cold, and I realized there was more, something even those messages hadn't hinted at. Fear surged inside me like a wave about to engulf me. The young man, undeterred, continued, "You blame each other, but you don't admit what you do in the shadows. How many people here knew she was seeing someone while pretending to be engaged?" The question hung in the air, and the silence that followed was more deafening than a scream. My daughter, exhausted, sat on the sofa. Her red eyes, trembling hands, and labored breathing betrayed her feeling trapped. Her boyfriend, for his part, seemed more concerned with his own image than with her. He pulled away, ran his hands through his hair, and began pacing in circles, muttering to himself, unable to face the reality he'd exposed. I stood motionless, just watching, but inside, I felt as if my life were being turned upside down in front of everyone. The spilled wine, the vengeful gesture, now seemed part of a script leading up to this point. It wasn't about stained clothes. It was about secrets spilling out in public. An older guest, a family friend, tried to intervene, saying, "This isn't the place to discuss such things, stop it." But it was too late. Pandora's box was already open, and there was no way to close it. Curiosity overcame any plea for discretion. Suddenly my phone vibrated again. The message was short but sharp. "That's not all. Wait until midnight." I almost dropped the phone. What could be more devastating than what was already exposed? What else was hidden that still needed to come to light? I looked at my daughter. She was staring at me, and in her eyes was a silent plea. "Don't abandon me." But at the same time, there was also the shadow of a truth she didn't have the courage to confess. This duality tore me apart. I wanted to hug her, protect her, but part of me also wanted answers, no mincing words. The atmosphere in the room was unbearable. Some guests began grabbing their coats, but no one actually left. It was as if they were trapped by an invisible magnet, unable to leave before seeing the outcome. The party was no longer hers, nor mine. It belonged to the secret that hung over everyone. The boy put away his phone, but before he did, he uttered a sentence that silenced everyone. "If you think this is bad, wait until you hear who's really behind it all." Those words made my heart skip a beat. Who was behind it? It wasn't just her slip-up. It wasn't just about a betrayal of her love. There was another force manipulating the game. The clock read 11:55 p.m. The room was filled with absolute tension. I knew the next 5 minutes would be crucial. What was about to happen wouldn't only define my daughter's image, but could tear our family apart. And I, in the midst of that storm, realized there was no turning back. Midnight was approaching, and with it would come the revelation that would change everything. The clock ticked cruelly. Each passing second sounded like a drumbeat in a funeral procession. It was 11:56 p.m., and the entire room seemed hypnotized by anticipation. I looked around and saw tense faces, sweaty hands holding nearly empty glasses, glances darting between my daughter and me, as if trying to weave an invisible thread between our histories. No one spoke anymore. The only sound was the insistent ticking, reminding everyone that the inevitable was about to happen. My daughter remained seated on the couch, her coat still stained over her dress, but her posture erect, like someone who knows there's no point in running away. Her boyfriend paced back and forth, visibly nervous, and my youngest, teary-eyed, wouldn't let go of my hand. I sensed genuine fear in her, not just for her sister, but for what this night was about to mean for all of us. The boy who had shown me the messages stood in the center of the room like a somber narrator. He said nothing, just waited. This wait was more painful than any accusation because it turned every second into torture. I knew he had more to reveal, but he seemed to savor the silence before the explosion. At 11:57 p.m., my phone vibrated again. The message said, "When midnight strikes, look at her. She won't be able to hide it anymore." I felt my blood run cold. Whoever was sending me those messages knew every detail, every step, as if they were inside our home, inside our privacy. And worse, they seemed absolutely certain that the revelation would come from her, from my daughter. I looked at her, her eyes fixed on the floor, her hands clasped in her lap, and her breathing heavy, rising and falling in time with anxiety. She no longer looked like a young woman celebrating her birthday, but rather a defendant awaiting sentencing. The image tore me apart, but I couldn't shake the thought. What secret was so big that it would turn the party itself into a courtroom? At 11:58 p.m., some guests began grabbing their bags and coats, but no one actually left. It was as if they were glued to the floor, unable to miss the outcome. I could hear the muffled whispers. What could it be? Is something really going to happen? What if it's just gossip? But behind these doubts, there was a collective certainty. Something serious was about to emerge. My daughter looked up at that moment and stared at me. She didn't say anything, but in her eyes there was a clear plea. Don't hate me. That look pierced my chest like a knife. I wanted to run, to her, hug her, protect her from everyone, but something inside me told me I needed to hear the truth too. I needed to know who she really was, beyond the image I'd always tried to maintain. At 11:59 p.m., her boyfriend stopped pacing and sat down beside her. He whispered something in her ear, but she turned her face away, refusing the comfort. He then put his head in his hands, as if he too was about to collapse. It was clear that whatever the secret was, it involved them both. And that made my heart shatter even more. The room seemed suspended in time. Eyes darted from the clock to them, and from them to me, as if I had the power to stop it, to stop the clock before it reached its destination. But I was as helpless as any guest. I just breathed deeply, trying not to let my hands shake too much. Finally, the largest hand aligned with 12. Midnight. A complete silence fell, heavy as lead. No one breathed. The boy with the cell phone raised his arm again, but before he could say anything, it was my daughter who stood up. She stood up slowly, as if every muscle weighed a ton. Her eyes were watery, but there was no more disguise. Her whole body trembled, but her voice, when it came, was firm. "Enough! I won't hide anymore." The words echoed through the room, and some guests even shifted in their chairs, as if watching a foretold spectacle. My heart raced. I knew she was going to speak, but I wasn't prepared to hear it. With each word she delayed, I felt the air grow thicker. The room seemed smaller, the faces closer, the tension more unbearable. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and then said, "I cheated." The impact was immediate. The words exploded like thunder, cutting off any attempt at denial. There was a collective murmur, some covering their mouths, others looking at her boyfriend, who simply lowered his head, unable to react. My legs felt weak, and I had to lean back in my chair. It wasn't just the confession itself. It was the way. She'd said it, bluntly, without apology, just a blunt fact. She'd cheated. But it wasn't yet clear with whom, and this pending detail seemed to be the missing blade that would sever any bond of trust once and for all. The boyfriend lifted his head, his eyes red, and shouted, "Say who?" The entire room awaited the answer. My daughter closed her eyes again, and the silence lasted for seconds that felt like hours. I barely breathed when she finally opened her lips. Her voice was low but loud enough for everyone to hear. "It was with someone you know." The unfinished sentence was the final blow to our patience. The suspense, which until then had been torture, now turned into collective despair. Everyone wanted to hear the name. Everyone waited for the revelation. And at that exact moment, my phone vibrated again. The message, short and definitive, said, "The name is worse than you imagine." I looked up at my daughter and realized she was about to say it. The entire room leaned forward as if every ear would suck in the next words. And I knew, deep down, that that name would change everything. Not just the party, not just the night, but the way our family would exist from then on. The air in the room seemed stagnant, as if the oxygen had been sucked out by collective anticipation. My daughter took a deep breath, her gaze lost between me, her younger sister, and her boyfriend, who stared at her as if facing a verdict. "It was with someone you know," she repeated, her voice trembling now. Each word sounded like a sentence no one wanted to hear. I squeezed my youngest daughter's hand tightly as she barely held back tears. Her face reflected fear, but also a strange sense of already knowing what was going on. This tormented me. It seemed everyone had clues except me. I was the only one who would find out there in public before scandal-hungry eyes. Her boyfriend approached her nervously and shouted, "Just say your name. You are not going to humiliate me further without telling the whole truth." His face was flushed. The veins in his neck bulged, and the entire room watched his every gesture as if it were the climax of a show. My daughter closed her eyes for a second, took a deep breath, and when she opened them, the word escaped. "The name is Mark." The silence that followed was almost physical, heavy, suffocating. Mark. My heart sank at the mention of that name. He wasn't just any acquaintance. Mark was a longtime neighbor, a close family friend, the husband of a friend of mine, and present at almost every barbecue and neighborhood gathering. He was someone I never would have imagined in that position, and that's precisely why the revelation fell like a bombshell. The guests reacted with immediate shock. Some clapped their hands over their mouths, others exchanged terrified glances. Her boyfriend collapsed as if punched in the stomach. He sat down, breathing heavily, repeating in a low voice, "It can't be. It can't be." The boy who had shown the messages confirmed, "I warned you. It was all there." My daughter cried, but she didn't try to deny it. Her silence was heavier than any excuse. I felt the world spin around me, and the image of Mark invaded my mind. The smiling man who always helped mow the lawn, who offered beer in the backyard, who greeted my family politely. Now, that same name was forever tarnished. A guest stood up abruptly and said, "This is crazy. You have no idea the damage you're causing." But no one could respond. The room was no longer a party space. It was a courtroom with stunned witnesses. With each passing second, The weight of the revelation spread like cracks in glass. I looked at my daughter and she stared back. In her eyes was a desperate plea. Understand me. But how could one understand something that destroyed not only their relationship, but also the trust between entire families? I felt indirectly betrayed, as if her mistake were also an affront to me, to the history I'd always tried to preserve. Her boyfriend struggled to his feet, looked at her one last time and said, his voice cracking, "You broke up with me." Then he walked out the door without looking back. The sound of the door slamming echoed like a final sentence. My daughter tried to call out to him, but her voice was lost in the air. Some guests took the opportunity to leave as well. The atmosphere was unbearable, and no one wanted to be complicit in this revelation. The sound of coats being picked up, hurried footsteps, and doors opening and closing formed a soundtrack of abandonment. The room, once full, was beginning to empty, but the weight of what had been said lingered. The youngest was crying softly, beside me. I stroked her hand, but I was broken inside. Part of me wanted to stand up and scream, demand explanations, but another part just wanted to disappear, as if that would save me from carrying the burden. Still, I stood firm, watching, because I knew it wasn't the end yet. My phone vibrated again. The message, short and cruel, read, "Now do you understand why I said the name was worse than you imagined?" My eyes welled up. Whoever was behind these messages seemed to know more than anyone in the room. And if someone was manipulating everything, perhaps there was still more to be revealed. My daughter, still standing, said aloud, "I was wrong. I have no excuses. I just couldn't stand living on appearances anymore." Those words resonated with everyone, because every person in that room knew exactly what she was talking about. The entire neighborhood, the facade, the practiced smiles. But hearing it from her that night was like watching a carefully constructed castle crumble in seconds. I glanced at the clock. It was 12:07 a.m. Midnight had passed, but the feeling was that the night hadn't revealed everything yet. The silence, the looks, the anticipation in the air. Everyone was waiting for more, as if the name's revelation were just the first layer of an even greater secret. I noticed something in the youngest eyes that frightened me. She knew more. She knew something that hadn't yet been said, and that something seemed to include me directly. Her tearful gaze also carried a weight of guilt. I understood in that moment that the next secret wouldn't come from outside, but from within our own home. And it was at that point that I realized we hadn't hit rock bottom yet. The worst was yet to come. The room was now emptier, but the weight that hung there seemed greater than when it was full. The scandal of the revealed name still echoed in the corners of the house like an unquenchable scream. A few glasses forgotten on the tables still trembled slightly from the impact of the door her boyfriend had slammed on his way out. I remained seated, trying to grasp the scale of what had just happened, when I noticed the youngest's gaze fixed on me. It wasn't just sadness, it was a plea. She approached slowly with hesitant steps and sat beside me. She held my hand tightly and whispered, "Mom, I need to tell you something before anyone else does." The tone of her voice made me shiver. It wasn't just the pain of seeing her sister exposed. It was the weight of someone who also carried a secret about to spill out. My heart raced. I knew her well enough to know she wasn't one to speak lightly. She'd always been more reserved, but also more honest. If he was about to reveal something, it was because there was no holding it back anymore. I took a deep breath and simply said, "Say it." But the word came out harsh, because part of me already feared the wound would be even deeper. She hesitated. She glanced around, making sure some of the guests still present weren't paying attention. But it was impossible to hide. Everyone was already watching our every move, as if expecting a second revelation. Her voice breaking, she finally said, "I knew what she was doing with Mark, and I didn't tell you." The words hit me like a punch. My stomach lurched. It wasn't just the eldest daughter's betrayal. It was the youngest silent complicity. And that complicity hurt me in a different way, because I'd always trusted that if something was wrong, she'd come to me. I stared at her in shock, and she was crying, apologizing before I could even react. I wanted to protect you, Mom. I didn't know how to say it. I thought it would pass, that she would stop. But she didn't. Her words were sharp knives. The idea that she had carried this burden alone for months tore me apart, but it also made me angry. I felt betrayed by both of them, as if my role as a mother had been ripped away from me. The guests watched the scene in silence. I knew this wasn't a conversation to be had in public, but there was no escape. The house was no longer mine. The intimacy was gone. The truth had become a spectacle, and there was no hiding anything anymore. The youngest daughter wiped away her tears and added in a whisper that barely escaped, "And that's not all. I also received messages, the same ones you received, and they said that you're also involved, even without knowing it." I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. "Me?" My voice echoed louder than I intended. Shock flashed across the faces of the few still in the room. I, who until then had seen myself only as a witness to my daughter's collapse, was now being pulled center stage. She nodded, her face pale. "The messages talk about you, Mom. They say you were used without realizing it, that this Mark, he didn't just get close to her. He also got close to you, to us, to the whole family. It was all planned." A shiver ran down my spine. I began to remember small things. Mark's small talk with me, the veiled compliments, the exaggerated closeness at neighborhood gatherings. I never gave a reason, never reciprocated, but now I wondered, could I unknowingly have been part of a much larger plot? The youngest's eyes begged for forgiveness, but I couldn't react. The weight of the revelation was too great. It wasn't just about the eldest and her betrayal. It was about manipulation, about how our entire family had been drawn into a wicked game. I felt dirty, even though I hadn't done anything. The guests began to murmur again. It was impossible to contain their curiosity. Some were already commenting aloud that it all seemed like a conspiracy, that it made no sense. But I knew, deep down, that it did. Every detail of our lives, every oversight, seemed to have been used as a piece on an invisible board. My phone vibrated again. The message read, "Now you know. But the final truth has not yet been told. Wait." I nearly threw the phone against the wall. What else could remain? What other layer of pain was yet to be ripped from us? My oldest daughter, still on the couch, wept silently. My youngest beside me wept guiltily. And I in the middle felt trapped with no way out. The house seemed to shrink, the walls closing in on us. The night had already taken more than I could bear, but there was still the promise of something worse. I glanced at the clock. It was just after 12:20 a.m. I knew that if there was one last revelation, it would come before the night was over. I took a deep breath, held both of their hands, and said, "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." But inside, I didn't believe those words myself, because deep down, I knew. Family doesn't always survive certain truths. The early hours of the morning were already approaching, and the room was plunged into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by heavy breathing and suppressed sobs. The few remaining guests seemed petrified, as if afraid to leave and miss the outcome of what was no longer a party, but a family breakdown laid bare for all to see. I looked at my daughters, one racked with guilt, and the other consumed by the weight of the secret, and felt as if the ground had dropped out from under us. My phone vibrated again, and this time my hands were slow to reach the device. I didn't. want to read anything else, didn't want to see any more words that could cut even deeper. But the fear of omission was greater. The message said, the final truth must come from her mouth. You know who I'm talking about? I didn't need to ask. It was from my oldest daughter. I took a deep breath and looked at her. Her face was swollen from crying, her heavy coat hiding her stained dress, and her gaze was empty, as if she were on the edge of a cliff. Daughter, she said in a firm voice, though trembling inside, if there's anything more, it's time to say it. Don't hold anything back. We have nothing left to lose. The entire room turned to her, and the weight of expectation became unbearable. She took a few seconds, as if gathering strength to cross an abyss. The tears fell again, but this time they weren't just of shame or anger. They were of release. It wasn't just Mark, she said, her voice breaking. A murmur of shock ran through the room. My body froze. He didn't manipulate me alone. Someone here helped. The sentence fell like a bombshell. Everyone looked at each other suspiciously. The idea that there was an accomplice among us turned the tension into terror. I felt my breath catch. Who? I asked, my voice almost broken. She took a deep breath and replied, It was his wife, the very woman you always called your friend. I felt a chill run through my chest. Mark's wife, my neighbor, my confidant in so many small talk, was an accomplice. Not just a victim, but part of the machine. The pieces began to fit together in my mind. Her exaggerated closeness to our family, the veiled comments, the unexpected visits. She knew everything. She allowed it. Maybe she even encouraged it. The few guests still present reacted with shock. Some stood, others covered their mouths. It felt like the world had turned upside down. Mark's wife wasn't present that night, but her shadow loomed large, suffocating each of us. My daughter continued, She knew everything, Mom, and she used it to manipulate me. She said if I didn't accept it, she would destroy you. My eyes filled with tears. It was more than I could bear. It wasn't just betrayal, it was blackmail. It was the manipulation of two women I considered close, my daughter and my friend, turned into pawns in a cruel game, orchestrated by a couple who smiled at our Sunday barbecues. My youngest daughter cried even louder as if the revelation weighed heavily on her as well. I hugged her, but the embrace didn't erase the pain. I felt crushed by the knowledge that we had all been used, that every gesture of friendship, every visit to the backyard, every piece of banal advice carried hidden poison. The room was in absolute shock. One of the remaining young men said, You need to report it. This can't go on like this. But the word report seemed distant, fragile, small compared to the extent of the emotional devastation already inflicted. Reporting it wouldn't erase the scars. It wouldn't restore what was lost. My exhausted daughter fell to her knees on the carpet, crying helplessly. I knelt beside her, stroking her hair, and said, You made a mistake, but you were manipulated. I won't abandon you. It was the first time that night I could say something with conviction. She looked at me with gratitude and despair, and in that look I realized that despite everything, there was still something to rebuild. The clock was already past 12:40 a.m. The party, which began with music, laughter, and raised glasses, now ended with debris scattered across the floor, dropped glasses, forgotten cake, truths that could no longer be buried. The silence that dominated the house was not one of peace, but of exhaustion, of an inner war being waged before everyone. I stood up, looked at them both, and said, Tomorrow the whole neighborhood will know, but today we know who we really are. And that truth, however painful, is what remains. No one answered. Silence was the only echo. The last guests began to leave, with heavy steps and awkward looks. The three of us, mother and daughters, were left amidst emotional wreckage, that could not be swept away with any broom. I closed the door behind them and leaned my forehead against the cool wood, trying to gather strength to face the next morning. When I returned to the living room, my daughters were still sitting silently like two lost children. I took a deep breath, sat between them, and held their hands. The spilled wine, the exposed secrets, the mysterious messages, all converged on a single point: the certainty that that night would forever change the way we saw not only ourselves, but also the world around us. The night was drawing in, and there was no more music, no toasts, no smiles, just the harsh truth that some stains never come out, no matter how many times you wash the fabric. And I knew, deep down, that that night would forever linger in us, like the sour smell of wine spilled on my coat. And so ended the party that could never again be called a party. It ended with the certainty that sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. It merely reveals that there's no going back to what we once were.